As we read through the wisdom literature, one natural question arises: what becomes of the wisdom tradition in the history of Jewish and Christian tradition? The wisdom literature leads us into the story of Jesus with some speculations about the nature of life and the relationship between God and humanity. But in Jesus, we don't find just another speculative philosopher. He's not merely a wise teacher. The claims that he makes are far too dramatic for that. So the question then becomes, for all the pointing towards Jesus that the wisdom literature did, how does Jesus fundamentally embody the Jewish idea of wisdom? How is he the fundamental source and identity of wisdom? One might reasonably expect that the fulfillment of Israel's prophetic tradition would be found in a prophet, or that the fulfillment of Israel's priestly tradition would be found in a priest. But the New Testament certainly makes both of these claims, though not alone. It presents Jesus through another lens, one that sometimes gets skipped over. Again and again, the New Testament authors describe Jesus using categories that unmistakably belong to the world of Israel's wisdom literature. He teaches in aphorisms, and he tells parables, and he gathers disciples around himself for instruction. He has moralistic teachings about character. He calls people toward a transformed way of living rather than a new set of beliefs. So the earliest Christians came to recognize that Jesus was doing something deeply familiar, even though it was entirely new. Before we explore the New Testament's explicit claims, it's helpful to remember what we mean by wisdom. Through the course of our talks about the wisdom literature, I've resisted defining wisdom simply as intelligence. It's not just information. It's practical knowledge ordered towards faithful living before God. And that comes from an accumulation of experiences of cause and effect that allow us then to have an accurate sense of future causes and effects. Wisdom is the cultivated ability to perceive reality truthfully and then to respond to it in right ways. Wisdom concerns the formation of our whole person, our character and our being and our purpose for living. It shapes the heart and the mind. It forms habits, though it doesn't simply offer theories about how those habits work. The wise person sees the world as God has made it and then learns to live within the moral and spiritual order that one perceives God has created. When we turn to the Gospels, the stories of Jesus, we discover that Jesus consistently addressed precisely these concerns. His teaching is not metaphysical. It more often asks how human beings should live in relation to God and to one another. He talks about common, casual, even petty things like anger and forgiveness and generosity, and prayer and anxiety. These are the same concerns that occupy Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. The continuity here is hard to miss. Jesus doesn't merely repeat the wisdom that's gone before. Every great teacher stands within a tradition, and it's true here as well, but teachers are supposed to deepen the tradition. And Jesus reshapes the wisdom tradition of Israel around himself. That lies at the heart of Christian theology. The English word for fulfillment can create confusion because it's not a replacement of what has come before. Remember, Jesus says, I come not to eliminate the law, but to fulfill it. I come not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Fulfillment describes a movement towards completeness, just like a seed becomes a tree, what the ancient Greeks would call its telos, its design, what it's supposed to become. The tree doesn't reject the seed, it emerges from it. In a similar way, Christians have understood Jesus being Israel's wisdom tradition's destination. The earlier writings were indispensable because of where they lead. They lead to the life of Jesus. You can see this already in the literary form of Jesus' teaching. Consider the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. Probably the part of Jesus' teaching that Jesus' teachings that looks most like the wisdom literature. Modern readers will often classify this simply as ethical instruction, but that fails to appreciate the place from which it comes. Like the sages of ancient Israel, Jesus addresses ordinary human experience. He talks about making up with a friend before we go to worship, and telling the truth when we speak, and being gracious towards our enemies, and being secretive about our charity. None of those themes are accidental. They're part of everyday life, and they're part of the wisdom literature. The Beatitudes, which kicks off the Sermon on the Mount, provide an excellent example. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. Those resemble the Beatitudes that appear throughout the Psalms and the wisdom literature. Psalm 1 opens with, "Blessed is the man." Proverbs repeatedly describes the blessedness of wisdom. So Jesus is using a literary form that pre-existed him while expanding its meaning. The blessed life is no longer measured by visible success or social standard. It's recognized through humility and purity of heart and faithfulness under persecution. One New Testament scholar, Richard Hayes, observed that Jesus consistently reorients inherited biblical themes around the reality of God's kingdom. Wisdom is no exception. He doesn't abandon Israel's moral vision. The concern shifts from outwards conformity to inwards transformation. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, anger receives as much attention as murder, and lust receives as much attention as adultery. So love extends beyond one's neighbors to include one's enemies. The external act is still important, but all of that is a manifestation of what's going on in the heart. So this should ring a bell. Throughout Proverbs, we encountered repeated exhortations to guard the heart and discipline the tongue and cultivate humility and pursue righteousness. So Jesus stands in that tradition. When the sages of Proverbs offer instruction, they appeal to the wisdom embedded within God's creation. They point towards patterns that attentive observers can recognize. Remember, we're supposed to look at the world and see God's handiwork, and Jesus affirms those patterns. But he also speaks in a strikingly personal way. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. He claims the authority to interpret the tradition definitively. Another biblical scholar, N.T. Wright, argues that Jesus understood himself as embodying Israel's story rather than merely commenting upon it. That helps explain the extraordinary confidence with which Jesus teaches. The wisdom tradition had always directed attention towards God's ordering of creation, and Jesus now presents himself as the decisive revelation of God's purposes. Look at Jesus' use of parables. Parables have been treated as simple illustrations designed to make a difficult idea easier to understand. But in reality, they're more sophisticated than that. Like the sayings of the Proverbs, they invite reflection. They don't create immediate certainty. A proverb compresses wisdom into a memorable sentence that we have to then meditate on and unpack. Parables do the same thing. Both require us, the listeners, to participate actively in the process of understanding. Consider the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the most famous today. At one level, it's a legal question concerning the identity of one's neighbor. Because in Jesus' day, the rabbis were debating, do we have to show the same affection and concern to people like the Romans and the Gentiles and the Samaritans as we do to our own people? But the parable accomplishes more than just the legal concern. It reshapes the listener's moral imagination. Compassion is not an abstract principle, it's flesh and blood. Wisdom literature has always sought the formation of character, and Jesus continues that same work through narrative rather than aphorism. The parable of the prodigal son does the same thing. It's not just a lesson about forgiveness. It causes us, the listeners, to think about resentment and repentance and family and generosity. We return to the parable throughout our lives because we discover new dimensions of it in every season. One of the distinctive features of Israel's wisdom tradition is its confidence that truth can be recognized through attentive reflection. And Jesus shares this confidence. His teaching draws repeatedly upon common realities of everyday life. Farmers sow seed, women bake bread, merchants buy pearls, shepherds go looking for sheep. This goes on in his parables, and none of those images is extraordinary or mystifying. He demonstrates that the ordinary world becomes luminous when viewed through the eyes of faith. The Jewish rabbi Abraham Heschel frequently emphasized that genuine religion belongs in wonder rather than mere information. Heschel's observation illuminates Jesus' teaching remarkably well, although he himself was not a Christian. Jesus awakens wonder by revealing unexpected depths within familiar realities. That's not more apparent anywhere than in his little invitation to consider the lilies of the field. The flowers themselves become our teachers. They don't have a voice, but they instruct us. By observing them, we see that God provides for the flowers, and Jesus says, if he'll do that for them, he'll do it for you. The wisdom tradition has encouraged such attentive observation to creation, and Jesus continues that practice. This kind of brings us to an important conclusion that emerges from our studies of the wisdom literature. Jesus belongs within the wisdom tradition, but he cannot be contained by it. We develop certain literary categories in Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes, and those prepare us to understand Jesus, but he goes well beyond them. The New Testament makes a far more astonishing claim than simply calling Jesus a wise teacher. I want to turn to the writings of Paul in the Gospel of John, where wisdom is no longer described merely as a human virtue or an attribute. It becomes inseparable from the person of Christ himself. The wisdom that called in the streets of Proverbs, that humbled Job before the mystery of creation, and that guided and instructed the teacher of Ecclesiastes to receive life as a gift, is the one whom John's gospel declares, the one through whom all things are made. The implications of that claim have shaped Christian theology for nearly 2,000 years, and they provide a fitting conclusion for our look at the wisdom literature. So let's turn to that now.